The grand hall of the Pentagon was silent, save for the precise click of heels on polished marble. Sergeant Kayla, Spectre. Vance stood at rigid attention, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the star-spangled banners lining the wall. The air was thick with the scent of floor wax and old pride. A 4-star general, his chest a mosaic of service, pinned the silver star to her uniform. The weight of the medal was nothing compared to the weight in her soul. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment, but Kayla felt detached, a ghost in the ceremony, just as she had been a ghost in the mountains of Cunner. Her mind drifted from the general's words about valor and sacrifice. It drifted to the dust, the heat, the coppery taste of fear that was as familiar as her own breath. The rifle. It always came back to the rifle. The one constant. The one truth. It was just a sniper rifle in her hands, a tool of exquisite lethality that she understood better than she understood herself. In the front row of dignitaries, Colonel David Miller did not watch the general or the sergeant. His eyes, sharp and analytical behind wire-rimmed glasses, were locked on the weapon. It was held with reverence by a stoic honor guard a few feet from Kayla. The colonel was from Army Historical Command, a man who spoke in dates and documents, not drone strikes and firefights. He had been invited as a formality, a nod to tradition. But now, protocol was forgotten. As the final note of the national anthem faded and the audience broke into respectful applause, Miller moved. He strode with a purpose that cut through the dignified chatter, bypassing generals and aides. He stopped directly in front of the honor guard, his focus solely on the sleek, cold steel of the M2010 sniper rifle. Kayla, shaken from her reverie, watched him, a flicker of confusion breaking through her stoicism. What was this historian doing? Miller's hand, instead of pointing to the medal on her chest, gestured to the rifle. His voice, though low, carried in the sudden quiet of the dispersing crowd a sharp, startling sound. Where in God's name did you get this weapon? The honor guard, a young private, flinched, his grip tightening on the stock. Sir, it's the sergeant's service weapon. For the ceremony. I can see that, Private, Miller said, his tone not unkind but intensely focused. He leaned closer, his finger hovering just inches from the rifle's receiver, near the bolt. He didn't touch it, as if it were a holy relic. These numbers. Right here. Kayla took an involuntary step forward, a protective instinct flaring. Colonel, that's my assigned rifle. Her voice was steady, but a thread of tension ran through it. This was her business. Her rifle. Miller finally looked at her, but his eyes were seeing something else, someone else. This wasn't always an M2010. Was it, Sergeant? The lower receiver, it's older. Much older. He turned back to the guard. May I? The private glanced nervously at Kayla, who gave a tight, hesitant nod. Miller carefully took the rifle, his hand surprisingly sure and respectful. He angled it to catch the light from the grand chandelier above. There, he whispered, almost to himself. Scratched right into the steel. Not stamped. Not engraved. Scratched by hand. Kayla moved closer, her training forgotten. She had cleaned that rifle 1,000 times. She knew every curve, every imperfection. But she had never truly seen those marks. She had always thought they were armorer's notations, meaningless identifiers from a past life. 7, 3, 2, 1, 9, Miller read aloud, each number falling like a stone in the quiet hall. He looked up at Kayla, his face pale, his academic composure completely shattered. The bustling ceremony around them faded into a distant hum. Sergeant Vance, I need you to tell me everything. Where did you get this rifle? The question hung in the air, heavy with an importance Kayla could not yet comprehend. The secret, etched in steel, was out. The silence in the secure briefing room was heavier than the Afghan dust. Kayla sat stiffly, the new silver star cold, foreign weight on her uniform. Colonel Miller paced slowly, the earlier shock in his eyes replaced by a grim intensity. He stopped and placed a single, grainy black and white photograph on the table between them. It showed a group of haggard men in filthy uniforms, their eyes holding a defiance that transcended the decades. "The Hanoi Hilton," Miller stated, his voice low. "1969. Your grandfather is the one on the left. Captain Jonathan Vance." Kayla's breath caught. She saw the family resemblance now, the same stubborn set of the jaw her grandfather had until the day he died. But the eyes were different. The eyes in the photo were haunted. The eyes of the man she knew were always gentle, always sad. He never talked about it. Not a word. "They rarely did," Miller said softly. He tapped a finger on the photograph, on a faint mark near her grandfather's hand. "But they found ways to record their history, to bear witness. That number 73219 was his. It was how the world knew he was still alive." He slid another document toward her, a scanned page from a declassified intelligence file. At the top was her grandfather's name, and below, the stark heading, "Recovery Item, M40 Sniper Rifle Components. This is a legend in certain circles, Sergeant. A story we could never fully confirm until now." Miller leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "The story goes that Captain Vance, an avid hunter before the war, managed to have critical components for a rifle smuggled into the camp Peace by Peace over 2 years. A sympathetic guard, a corrupt official, we don't know the full chain. But he assembled it, hid it. It was never meant to be used for an escape. It was a symbol, a promise that they would fight back, that they hadn't been broken." Kayla stared at the document, the sterile words failing to capture the sheer audacity of the act. The rifle she had carried, the tool she had trusted with her life, had been born in a prison cell on the other side of the world. It had been an act of pure, defiant hope. After the war, the prisoners were liberated. The official story was that all contraband was destroyed. But Captain Vance, according to a single uncorroborated debrief, managed to disassemble the rifle and smuggle the most vital part, the receiver, the very heart of the weapon, out in his personal effects. He kept it for decades. Miller's gaze was unwavering. "Your file says you were raised by him after your parents passed. He taught you to shoot. He gave you that rifle before he died." Kayla nodded, her throat tight. She remembered the old ranch, the smell of gun, oil, and pine. Her grandfather's large, calloused hands guiding her smaller ones on the stock of a hunting rifle. He said it saw true. He said it was the only thing that never lied. "It saw true because it had already seen hell," Miller murmured. He pointed again at the numbers on the receiver she now held cradled in her arms. He had those numbers scratched into it after he returned home. A permanent record. So he would never forget the men who didn't come back. This rifle, Sergeant Vance, isn't just a weapon. It's a memorial. It's one of the most significant artifacts to come out of that war. The room seemed to spin. The professional distance Kayla maintained from her gear, the emotional wall she built to do her job, crumbled. This piece of steel was a direct link to a pain she had only ever sensed in her grandfather's quiet moments. It was no longer a sniper rifle. It was his soul, entrusted to her, and she had carried it into battle without knowing the sacred weight of its history. The realization was a physical blow, leaving her utterly speechless. The sharp, electronic chirp of her military-issue satellite phone shattered the profound silence of the room. Kayla jumped. The sound of violent intrusion into the sacred space of memory Colonel Miller had just opened. The spell was broken. Miller's eyes narrowed, the historian instantly replaced by the soldier as he watched her react. Kayla fumbled for the device, her hands feeling clumsy. "Vance," she answered, her voice rough with emotion she struggled to suppress. The voice on the other end was all business, a clipped, urgent stream of data. "Spectre, stand by for immediate mission brief. Wheels up in 30. A 5-man ODA team is pinned down in the Karangao. Heavy enemy contact. They're the only QRF in range. You're on Overwatch. The words Karangal, ODA, QRF were like a bucket of ice water. The ghost of her grandfather faded, replaced by the immediate, terrifying reality of the moment. Copy. On my way, she said, her voice now flat and professional. She ended the call and looked at Miller. The confusion and awe were gone from her face, replaced by the focused calm of a predator. Colonel, I have to go. Miller stood up, his expression grave. He understood the finality in her tone. The Karangal Valley, he began, a note of dread in his voice. He had read the reports. He knew the names the soldiers had for that place. They call it the Valley of Death for a reason, Kayla finished for him, already moving toward the door. She paused for a fraction of a second, her hand resting on the rifle case containing the M2010. The steel felt different now. It was no longer just a tool. It felt alive with history, heavy with a legacy she was only beginning to understand. Taking a deep breath, she slung the case over her shoulder. The weight was immense, but it was a weight she had to carry. 30 minutes later, the roar of the Chinook helicopter's twin rotors was a physical force, vibrating through the metal deck and into Kayla's bones. She sat with her team, faces painted with grim determination, each lost in their own pre-combat thoughts. The spotter, a young corporal named Jessup, nudged her knee and pointed to her rifle, then gave her a thumbs up. It was their standard gesture. You good? She nodded, but the gesture felt hollow. As the helicopter lurched into the air, Kayla looked down at the rifle in her lap. In the dim red light of the cabin, she ran her gloved thumb over the scratch numbers. 73219. She wasn't just carrying a sniper system anymore. She was carrying her grandfather's defiance. She was carrying the hope of men who had been imprisoned and tortured. The responsibility was terrifying. What if she failed? What if this legacy, preserved through so much sacrifice, was lost because of her? The crew chief's voice crackled in her headset, pulling her from the thought. 10 minutes to LZ. Look sharp. The cabin was filled with the metallic clatter of weapons being checked one final time. Kayla chambered around, the sound crisp and final. She looked through her scope, the world narrowing to a circle of clarity. The mountains below were dark and jagged, a landscape of shadows and threats. Somewhere down there, men were fighting for their lives. And she was their ghost, their specter. But now, she was also something more. She was a promise scratched into steel a lifetime ago, flying directly into the heart of the modern-day Valley of Death. The two worlds, past and present, had violently collided, and she was the point of impact. The Chinook shuddered violently, a beast caught in a trap. The pilot's voice was a strained crackle in her headset. Taking ground fire. Evasive maneuvers. The world outside the open ramp became a dizzying tilt of green ridges and bleached sky. Kayla gripped a cargo strap, her knuckles white. Jessup braced himself against the fuselage, his face a mask of concentration as he tried to pinpoint the source of the tracers arcing up from the tree line. RPG. Left side, someone yelled. The helicopter banked so sharply that Kayla's feet left the deck. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked past the tail rotor, a near miss that filled the cabin with the smell of burnt fuel and cordite. The pilot's voice returned, tight with controlled panic. We can't make the primary, LZ. Setting down in the emergency zone, 2 clicks south. Be ready for a hot dismount. The landing was a jarring, bone-rattling impact. The moment the ramp lowered, the world exploded in noise. The deafening roar of the engines was drowned out by the sharper, more immediate crack of incoming small arms fire. Go, 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 the team sergeant screamed. They spilled out into a rocky creek bed, the water icy around their boots. The Chinook, already lifting off, was a fleeing whale, its downdraft whipping dust and pebbles into a stinging cloud. For the next hour, they moved with a grim, practiced urgency. The mission had instantly shifted from a quick response insertion to a desperate ground infiltration. Every shadowed rock, every gnarled tree could conceal an enemy fighter. The weight of the rifle was a constant presence on Kayla's back, a tangible link to the past that felt both like a burden and a shield. She remembered her grandfather's stories, not of war, but of hunting in the Texas Hill Country. The lessons were the same: patience, stillness, reading the wind. They reached a ridgeline overlooking the Korangal proper. The valley lay before them, a deep, sinister scar in the earth. Jessup set up his spotting scope. "I've got them," he whispered, his voice grim. Grid reference confirmed. "They're on a ledge, about 800 meters out. They're completely pinned. I count at least a dozen hostiles with clear fields of fire." Kayla found a position between two boulders, the granite cool against her cheek. She unfolded the bipod of her M2010, the movement smooth and automatic. She settled behind the scope, and the world narrowed to a circle of magnified horror. She saw the trapped ODA team, 5 men pressed against the rock face. She saw the enemy positions, muzzle flashes winking from behind cover. The crosshairs of her scope drifted over a fighter manning a PKM machine gun, the weapon spitting a deadly stream of fire that kept the Americans' heads down. The wind was tricky, gusting unpredictably up the valley walls. The mirage heat rose from the rocks, distorting the image. It was a terrible shot, a 1 in a million shot. Jessup confirmed it. "Winds all over the place, Spectre. 3 o'clock, but it's shifting. Hold, 10 miles an hour. Now 15. This is a nightmare." Kayla took a slow, deep breath, blocking out the distant rattle of gunfire, the frantic radio chatter in her ear. She exhaled halfway, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. In that moment of supreme focus, she wasn't just Kayla Vance. She was her grandfather's hands steadying the rifle in a dark prison cell. She was his will to survive. The crosshairs steadied, finding their mark. The chaotic world fell silent. There was only the target, the wind, and the promise etched into the steel she held. The shot was no longer hers alone to make. The world shrank to the space inside her scope. The frantic radio chatter, Jessup's tense breathing beside her, the oppressive heat, it all melted away. There was only the crosshair, the shimmering heat mirage distorting the image of the enemy machine gunner, and the faint, almost imperceptible whisper of the wind against her cheek. She could feel the ghost of her grandfather's hands on the stock, a phantom steadiness guiding her own. This was no longer just a shot for a medal or a mission report. It was a shot for the men in that black and white photograph. It was a shot to honor the defiance scratched into the steel. Her finger applied the slightest, steady pressure. The rifle roared, a single, sharp crack that echoed across the valley. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, through the scope, she saw the PKM gunner slump forward, his weapon falling silent. A wave of relief was immediately replaced by a surge of adrenaline. Target neutralized. Jessup barked into his radio. "Spectre has fire superiority. ODA team, move. Now." Chaos erupted. The trapped soldiers scrambled from their cover, laying down suppressing fire as they attempted to break out. The enemy, momentarily stunned by the loss of their heavy weapon, redirected their fury towards the ridgeline. Bullets snapped overhead, ricocheting off the rocks around Kayla and Jessup with angry whines. "Multiple shooters, 10 o'clock. 200 meters. Jessup called out, his voice calm but urgent. Kayla worked the bolt, the spent casing ejecting with a metallic ping. She found the next target, a fighter aiming an RPG towards the escaping ODA team. Breathe. Hold. Squeeze. Another crack. The man crumpled, the rocket launcher clattering harmlessly to the ground. She became a machine of precise, ruthless efficiency. Each shot was a calculation of wind, range, and gravity, but it was also something more. It was an act of preservation. With every round she fired, she was protecting the legacy she carried. The rifle, once a symbol of hope in a prison camp, was now an instrument of salvation in a different kind of hell. She was the bridge between the two. The ODA team fought their way down the ledge, linking up with Kayla's unit in a furious exchange of gunfire. The team sergeant slapped her on the shoulder as he passed, his face grimy and etched with gratitude. "Hell of a shot, Spectre. Now, let's get the hell out of here." The joint force began a fighting retreat back towards the emergency extraction point. The enemy, however, was not giving up. They swarmed like angry hornets, using the rugged terrain to their advantage. As the team navigated a narrow defile, a massive explosion ripped through the air. An RPG round impacted the cliff face above them, showering the team with rock and debris. The concussive blast knocked Kayla off her feet. Her head slammed against a rock, and for a few disorienting seconds, the world went black and silent. When her vision cleared, she saw Jessup lying motionless a few feet away, a trickle of blood running from his temple. The rest of the team, believing they were all behind them, had already pushed forward through the dust cloud. The enemy's shouts were getting closer. She was alone, with an unconscious spotter, and the echoing cracks of rifle fire were now aimed directly at her position. The legacy was isolated, and the valley was closing in. The world snapped back into a terrifying, crystal-clear focus. The ringing in her ears was deafening, but the sound of approaching voices, shouting in Pashto, cut through it like a knife. Jessup was out cold, his breathing shallow. They were cut off. Panic was a cold fist closing around her heart, but she crushed it. Panic meant death. It meant failing Jessup. It meant failing the rifle. She dragged Jessup by his body armor, grunting with the effort, into a shallow depression behind a large boulder. It was poor cover, but it was all they had. She propped him up, checked his pulse. It was there, thready but steady. "Hold on, Jess," she whispered, her voice rough with dust. The first enemy fighter appeared at the mouth of the defile, his head swiveling. Kayla didn't have time to aim properly. She raised the rifle from the hip, a desperate, unsupported shot. The crack was loud in the confined space. The man cried out and fell. It was a lucky hit, but it bought her seconds. She scrambled back behind the boulder, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was a sniper. She needed distance, a field of view. This was close quarters hell. She ejected the spent round and chambered another, the familiar mechanical action calming her frayed nerves. She thought of her grandfather in his cell, surrounded by enemies with nothing but his wits and his secret weapon. The parallel was chilling. She was living his nightmare. Two more fighters rushed in, firing wildly. Bullets chipped the rock above her head. She leaned out just enough to expose the barrel. She aimed at the lead man's center mass and fired. He dropped. The second fighter hesitated, and that hesitation was fatal. Her second shot was cleaner, more controlled. He fell beside his companion. Silence descended, more menacing than the gunfire. They knew where she was now. They would flank her. She was a cornered animal. She checked Jessup's gear, grabbing an extra magazine for her rifle and a fragmentation grenade from his webbing. The voices were moving, circling. She could hear rocks skittering to her left and right. They were trying to pin her in. She made a decision. She couldn't stay. She had to become the ghost again. She had to move. With a final glance at Jessup, she low-crawled out from behind the boulder, using the bodies of the fallen fighters as macabre cover. The stench of blood and cordite filled her nostrils. She slithered into a narrow crevice in the rock wall, pulling herself into the darkness. It was a tight fit, but it gave her a sliver of a view back towards the defile. She saw three figures cautiously approaching the boulder, where Jessup lay hidden. They thought she was still there. She settled the rifle, her breathing shallow. The scope was useless at this range. She used the iron sights, her world narrowing to the post and the notch. She fired 3 times, rapid, precise shots. 1, 2, 3. All 3 men fell. The grenade. It was her only chance to break the encirclement. She pulled the pin, held the spoon, and counted. 1 1,000. 2 1,000. She leaned out and lobbed it in a high arc towards the sound of the most voices on her left flank. The explosion was deafening in the narrow space, a blast of heat and shrapnel that was followed by screams. In the ringing silence that followed, a new sound emerged. It was faint at first, then growing steadily louder. A deep, rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the very rock she lay against. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The distinct, powerful beat of Apache helicopter rotors. A calm, steady voice broke through on her radio. "Spectre, this is Paladin 6. Colonel Miller said you might need a hand. We have your signal. Just hang on." Help was coming, but the fight for survival was not over yet. The roar of the Apaches was a promise of salvation, but the valley was not yet ready to release its prey. The enemy, knowing their time was short, launched a final, desperate assault. A hail of gunfire erupted from the tree line, peppering the rocks around Kayla's position. They were shooting blindly, hoping for a lucky hit before the helicopters arrived. She pressed herself deeper into the crevice, fragments of stone stinging her face. She had to protect Jessup. She had to hold this tiny piece of ground for just a few minutes more. The legacy rifle felt hot in her hands. It had been built for survival against impossible odds, and it would not fail now. She leaned out, firing 2 quick shots towards the muzzle flashes. The return fire intensified, forcing her back into cover. Then, the world above her exploded. The lead Apache opened up with its 30mm chain gun. The sound was not a series of shots, but a continuous, ripping roar, like fabric being torn apart. Tracers carved a line of fire through the trees, obliterating everything in their path. The ground shook with the impact. The enemy fire ceased abruptly, replaced by screams of terror and the crashing of splintered timber. A shadow fell over her. The second Apache hovered like a vengeful angel, its rotors churning the dust into a blinding storm. Through the maelstrom, she saw a Black Hawk helicopter descending into a clearing 50 meters away. The crew chief leaned out, waving frantically. "Spectre, we're here. Move." But Jessup was still behind the boulder. There was no way she was leaving him. Ignoring the safety of the crevice, she scrambled out into the open. Bullets whined past her. A lone, stubborn fighter was still alive. She didn't break stride. She raised the rifle, fired for shoulder on the move, and saw the man fall. It was an act of pure, fluid instinct, a fusion of her training and the rifle's inherited will. She reached Jessup and slung his unconscious form over her shoulders in a fireman's carry, grunting under the weight. Her legs burned. Her lungs screamed for air. Every step towards the waiting Black Hawk was a marathon. The crew chief leaped out and ran to meet her, grabbing Jessup and hauling him into the cabin. He then turned and offered a hand to Kayla. As she reached for it, a single, final shot rang out from the shattered tree line. She felt a searing impact in her side, a punch that knocked the wind from her. She stumbled, her vision blurring. The crew chief lunged forward, catching her before she hit the ground. He half-dragged, half-carried her the last few feet into the helicopter. The Black Hawk lifted off sharply, banking away from the valley. Inside, the noise was overwhelming. The roar of the engine, the wind whipping through the open doors. A medic was already working on Jessup. Another turned to Kayla, his hands pressing a bandage against the warm, spreading wetness on her side. The pain was a distant, throbbing thing. Her grip on the rifle had not loosened. Through the open door, she watched the valley of death fall away beneath them, its terrors finally receding. They had made it. They were alive. But as she looked down at the blood staining her uniform, she knew the legacy had come at a cost. The circle of sacrifice was not yet complete. The pain in her side was a dull, persistent ache, a constant reminder of the valley. But as she stood at attention in the Pentagon Hall, the memory of the wound was overshadowed by the weight of the silver star on her chest. The ceremony was a blur of polished shoes, crisp uniforms, and the distant murmur of applause. Her eyes were not on the general pinning the medal, nor on the cameras. They were fixed on the familiar, stern face of Colonel David Miller in the front row. He was not looking at her. His gaze was locked on the sniper rifle held by the honor guard, his expression one of profound, quiet vindication. After the formalities ended, as the crowd began to disperse in a hum of conversation, Miller approached her. He bypassed the congratulations, the handshakes from senior officers. He stopped before her, and in his hands he held not a citation, but a small, worn, leather-bound notebook. Its cover was cracked with age. "The circle is now closed, Sergeant Vance," he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. He offered her the book. This was his, recovered from his personal effects after he passed. It took my team years to fully decode it. It's not a diary of war. It's a diary of the men who didn't make it home. Kayla's hand trembled as she took it. The leather was soft, imprinted with the shape of her grandfather's life. She opened it carefully. The pages were filled with neat, faded handwriting, but next to many names were tiny hand-drawn sketches, a smile, a pair of glasses, a distinctive hat. He hadn't just recorded their names. He had preserved their faces, their personalities. "He would be proud of you, Kayla," Miller said, using her first name for the first time. Not for the medal, but for understanding, for carrying the memory. He gave a sharp, respectful nod, then turned and walked away, his mission finally complete. Later, alone in the quiet of the armory, Kayla placed the M2010 back into its case. The sterile fluorescent light gleamed on the steel. She did not close the lid immediately. Instead, she laid the small, worn notebook gently beside the rifle. Then, she reached out and ran her fingertips over the numbers scratched into the receiver. 73219. The gesture was no longer one of confusion or even discovery. It was a communion. A slow, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time since her return. It was a smile of peace, of understanding. The ghost had finally been laid to rest. The weapon was no longer an instrument of death, but a bridge. It connected a grandfather's silent sacrifice in a humid prison cell to a granddaughter's violent courage in a sun-scorched valley. It was a testament to a promise kept across generations, a silent oath etched not just in steel, but in the very bloodline of a family who served. The rifle would remain a silent witness to the past and a guardian for the future. It was never just a sniper rifle. It was a legacy, whole at last,